Detective Mike Hargis.
James Moore would point out marks on the bat and say these are the marks that were caused by Skippy's teeth. And they all had referred to Patrick Zack as Skippy. So he would show it to them and laugh about it and just generally brag about what he had done and how he'd done it.
The information provided investigators with enough probable cause to take James Moore and Eric Tadana into custody for suspicion of murder.
What's up, Panic Fam? I'm Hannah. And if it's 2 a.m., the lights are off and the popcorn has gone cold, you know, it's Panic TV time. Welcome. If you survived this, and this, congratulations, all right? Congratulations, but your luck runs out here.
In Texas, an open field becomes a killer's makeshift burial ground. To find their suspect, investigators must first identify the victims from the tattered bones. A teenager looking for stray golf balls stumbles upon buried human remains. Scientists try to reconstruct the victim's face to help solve the mystery. A movie director goes missing in California. But before police can prove murder, they have to find the victim's body. Some killers choose to lay their victims to rest unceremoniously. Investigators must then rely on forensic examiners to uncover proof of murder and expose the killer's buried secrets. In July of 1994, the city of Austin, Texas was in the midst of a brutal summer heat. 20 miles outside of the city, in the small community of Round Rock, an off-duty officer spotted an abandoned vehicle parked off the main road. The officer ran the tag number and learned the car was registered to a woman named Sandra Dumont. But there was no sign of the owner. After noticing that one of the tires was flat, the officer decided to continue on, convinced the woman would eventually return for the disabled vehicle. A few weeks later, the same officer came across Sandra Dumont's name again. According to an article in the local paper, the young woman had been reported missing from her Austin home. The officer decided to return to the field where he had first come across Sandra's vehicle. The car had subsequently been towed. But the officer noticed a foul odor. He began searching the area. Nearby, hidden in some overgrowth, he found a woman's shoe. Then, a few feet away, the officer noticed an uneven sheet of plywood oddly placed in the middle of the pasture. When he lifted it up, he discovered the partial skeletal remains of a human body. The officer immediately called for assistance. Officers from the Round Rock Police Department responded to the scene. Police spread out and began scouring the field for any clues to tell them who this person was and how she had ended up here. "100 yards away from where the skeletal remains were discovered, investigators found another human skull. Police feared they had stumbled upon a killer's makeshift cemetery. The team expanded their search of the field to cover the entire 110 acres. More bones were found scattered around the area. Police recovered several items of women's clothing. The garments appear to have been cut with a sharp instrument. Police also collected a few menthol cigarette butts found near the remains. As the search for evidence continued, a young woman arrived at the scene, wanting to speak with detectives. She had been watching live media coverage of the search and feared that one of the victims was her missing friend, Sandra Dumont. She said the last time she spoke with her, Sandra was going out on a date with a man named Roger. The friend had never actually met Sandra's new boyfriend and wasn't sure of his last name. When Sandra went missing, the friend retrieved her address book. When she found it, it was open to the name of Roger Fain.
Who do you think he was dating? It looks like there's a name in it.
But until investigators could positively identify the victims, the information was of little value.
Let's go ahead and document this.
Using the dental records of known missing persons in the area, the medical examiner was able to establish both victims' identities. Sandra Dumont was one of them. The second victim was identified as Darlene Anderson, a 38-year-old Round Rock native who had been reported missing by her husband a month earlier. Both women appeared to be the victims of homicide. To determine how they died, forensic anthropologist Dr. Susanna Dana studied the bones.
You're looking for signs of trauma on the bones. You're looking for evidence of any kind of blunt force injury to the bones that would have produced fractures. You're looking for cuts in the bones that could be due to knives or a sharp instrument. You're looking for holes in the bones, especially the skull, which could be due to a gunshot wound.
Sandra Dumont's skull had such a wound. She had been shot at point-blank range by a .22 caliber weapon. Dr. Dana also found a fracture to Sandra Dumont's jawbone. And bloodstains on the mandible suggested that the victim had bled as a result of the injury. That meant the injury occurred prior to death.
It was consistent with a blow to the mandible, directly to the mandible by some blunt object, possibly a fist or a large stick or a large piece of wood, or like a bat can produce that kind of injury.
Looking for any trace of the killer that may have been left behind, forensic examiner Steve Robertson carefully scoured the clothing found near Sandra Dumont's remains. He found several tears and cuts. But the lack of blood found around the holes suggested that the garments had been cut from her body prior to her death. It appeared that Sandra Dumont had been tortured before being murdered. Detectives from the Round Rock Police Department feared they were dealing with a serial killer. Lieutenant Dan LeMay began looking into Sandra's background for clues to the killer's identity.
Sandra Dumont was 39 years old and living in the Austin area. She had a degree and was a very well-educated woman. She actually was employed as a blackjack dealer and was looking for better employment, attempting to better herself. From all accounts, she was a very nice person. Everybody liked her quite a bit.
Detectives traveled to the Austin club where Sandra was working the night before she disappeared. Co-workers said that Sandra had received a call during her shift that night.
Very good.
While on the phone, she seemed agitated and upset. The co-workers overheard her making plans to meet with someone. They believed it was her boyfriend, but they were not certain. When Sandra finished the conversation, she asked the manager if she could take off early. The manager agreed. He never heard from Sandra again. Police turned their attention to the name found in Sandra's address book. Investigators learned that Roger Eugene Fain had been a suspect in the disappearance of Darlene Anderson, the other victim unearthed at the pasture. Though police had been unable to tie him to her disappearance, something else now caught their attention. Roger Fain lived in a neighborhood just a short distance away from where the two bodies had been discovered. Police went to question the 41-year-old handyman. He claimed he didn't know anyone named Sandra Dumont, and he couldn't explain why his name was in her address book. Insisting he had nothing to hide, Fain gave detectives permission to search his truck. Investigators recovered cigarette butts and a few stray hairs from inside the cab. When asked about the injury to his arm, Fain stated he'd injured his wrist when the heavy lid of the large toolbox in the flatbed of his truck fell shut on it. But a rubber gasket, which lined the lid of the toolbox, made police suspicious of the story. Investigators forwarded what little evidence they had recovered to the crime lab. Trying to verify his statements, investigators contacted Fain's friends and associates.
Mr. Fain told several people that he'd injured his hand by dropping the lid of his truck toolbox on it. He also told at least one person, I believe, that he caught it in the hood of his truck. I seem to remember that he told one person he injured it at work, and it was some type of workman's comp claim. I think that the total numbers were something like 7 totally different stories to 9 different individuals on how he injured his hand.
The inconsistencies convinced the police that Fain was trying to hide something. Investigators hoped the hairs and cigarette butts recovered from Fain's truck would tell them what that was. Examiners at the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab compared samples of Sandra Dumont's hair to those found in Roger Fain's truck. They didn't match. The cigarette butts found in Fain's truck, however, were determined to be the same menthol brand as the butts recovered near the buried bodies. But the cigarette butts recovered from the pasture were too degraded for a more comprehensive DNA analysis. Investigators turned their attention to the injury on Fain's wrist, believing that was somehow the key to exposing his guilt. At a local hospital, they tracked down the suspect's x-rays. Police learned he was treated for the break the day after Sandra Dumont disappeared. The x-rays were sent to forensic anthropologist Dr. Susanna Dana. After reviewing the evidence, Dr. Dana concluded that the fracture was consistent with what is called a boxer's break, an injury that results from pressure on the bone resulting from punching a hard object. Recalling that Sandra Dumont's jaw had been fractured, Dr. Dana looked to see if Fain's injury could have resulted from punching the victim.
In my opinion, it's very consistent with that injury to her mandible occurring from a closed fist, and he had a broken bone in his fist, occurring around the same time that this individual had disappeared.
Though circumstantial, the information was enough to allow investigators to obtain a warrant to search Fain's home. There, they recovered a leather pouch containing .22 caliber rounds, the same size as the bullet hole found in both victims' skulls. Police collected everything they could, including a roll of undeveloped film. Evidence technician Steve Robertson explains.
I collected it because we were hoping to find a photograph of the victim in this house, since he had denied knowing her.
The search team sent the undeveloped roll to the crime lab for processing. To their disappointment, the roll contained no photographs of Sandra. But then, examiners noticed something odd. 2 of the pictures were of the pasture where the victims' bodies had been recovered. Investigators noticed a dark mass in the middle of the photographs. On closer look, they realized it was the exact spot where Sandra Dumont's remains were lying. Like many other killers, Roger Fain had been compelled to keep a memento of his crime.
That was incredible. It was the first time that I really believed we would be able to get the conviction on that case.
Roger Fain was placed under arrest and charged with the murder of Sandra Dumont. Despite the overwhelming amount of evidence against him, he continued to maintain his innocence. Police believe that on July 24, 1994, Sandra left work early to meet with her new boyfriend, Roger Fain. But the killer had other plans. Fain lured Sandra to the pasture, where he beat and then shot her to death. He buried her remains and then calmly walked home, leaving Sandra's car in plain sight. On April 2, 1995, a Texas jury found Roger Eugene Fain guilty of the first-degree murder of Sandra Dumont. He was sentenced to life in prison. Police are still searching for evidence to connect Roger Fain to the murder of Darlene Anderson.
We'd like to ask that if anyone knows anything about that murder, that they contact us and they contact the Round Rock Police Department and pass that information on. We're concerned, because of the type of offender that Mr. Fain is, that there may be other victims that we're unaware of. There may be other criminal behavior that we don't know about.
Though Roger Fain never told anyone about his crime, he betrayed himself with the lies he told and the photographs he took. But even when killers brag about a murder, police must still rely on solid physical evidence to win a conviction. On May 8, 1996, a teenager near Fort Worth, Texas, scoured the wooded areas of a golf course looking for stray balls. He noticed something unusual protruding from a dirt mound. As he approached, he realized it was the skeletal remains of a human hand. In Tarrant County, Texas, a teenager searching for stray golf balls had stumbled upon buried human remains. When investigators responded to the scene, it was clear they had unearthed a clandestine grave, one constructed to conceal a violent murder. The male victim had suffered massive trauma to the skull. Advanced decomposition made it difficult to discern any identifiable features. Technicians began scouring the dirt in and around the grave, searching for any clues to the man's identity. They recovered a metal cross necklace still draped around the victim's neck. but little else was found. Frustrated, investigators left the scene unsure who they had unearthed and why he had been murdered. With only bones to work with, medical examiners began searching for answers. In addition to the blunt force trauma to the skull, there were several nicks observed on the victim's ribs. This led the team to conclude that the male victim had been stabbed to death. Other than a red scorpion tattoo on the victim's shoulder, no identifying features remained. Examiners knew that determining when this victim died would be critically important in helping to establish his identity. Tarrant County Chief Deputy Medical Examiner Mark Krause looked to the victim himself for clues.
The deeper parts of the body were turned to adipocere, which is sort of a rancid soap-like material that takes, in this part of the world here in that time of year, takes a minimum of about 5 to 6 weeks to begin to accumulate to the degree we were seeing it.
Tarrant County Police released the few details they had on this John Doe to law enforcement agencies throughout Texas, hoping that the information would spark recognition from the public. The tactic appeared to work. Several people called in, hopeful their missing loved ones had been found. But in the end, none of the characteristics of the body found at the golf course matched details of known missing persons. According to Tarrant County Detective Mike Hargis, until police could give this victim a name, making a case for murder would be difficult.
It's very frustrating not to know who your victim is, because it doesn't really give you a starting point. Your starting point is usually their identity, so you can start tracing their background. We have to do a victimology, find out who your person is, what their risk level is, who they associate with, where they hang out at, things of that nature. And that can also tell you a lot about who might have been involved in their murder. And so it's very frustrating not to know where to start.
They turned back to forensic examiners for help.
Ugh, I swear my neighbors think I'm probably getting murdered right now.
Forensic anthropologist Dr. Dana Austin was asked to create a biological profile of the victim. And though there wasn't much to work with, Dr. Austin can learn a lot about an individual by studying their skeletal structure. From the width of the brow ridge and other facial features, Dr. Austin concluded that the victim was a Caucasian male. Next, she needed to determine the victim's age.
In this case, in order to estimate the age, it was obvious that this person was not fully mature skeletally. There are gaps in between these bones that in an adult it would be completely fused.
Dr. Austin concluded the victim was between 17 and 21 years of age. To bring this victim to life, Dr. Austin next attached tissue depth markers to 21 different points on the skull. These markers reflect the average thickness of skin for people of similar race, age, and sex. After the skull was photographed from various positions, a forensic artist was brought in to create the contours of the victim's face. From that, a composite sketch was developed and then forwarded to Tarrant County investigators. Police released the sketch through the media. But again, nobody was able to identify John Doe number 87. Years passed without a break in the case. Chances that the mystery victim would ever find justice dwindled, and detectives began to believe that his killer may never be found. For 3 years, police in Tarrant County, Texas struggled to solve the murder of a young man whose skeletal remains were found buried in a shallow grave. Though forensic examiners had given John Doe a face, his identity and the circumstances surrounding his death remained a mystery. Then, on December 3rd, 1999, police finally got a break. A woman in nearby Fort Worth came in to speak with police. She believed she knew the identity of the man found buried in nearby Tarrant County years earlier. She explained that around that time, she and her boyfriend, James Moore, were in the process of moving into a different apartment. While packing up their belongings, James and his best friend, 𝐿𝐼𝐸 began laughing after finding a newspaper article they had saved from a few months earlier. When the girlfriend asked what was so funny, the men showed her an article about a body found buried at a local golf course. They told her the unidentified victim was an acquaintance of theirs, a 20-year-old man named Patrick 𝐂𝐸. Fort Worth police quickly forwarded the information to authorities at the Tarrant County Sheriff's Department. Homicide Detective Mike Utley, assigned to the cold case squad, jumped on the lead. To verify the information, he began searching the database for a Patrick 𝐂𝐸. Though no one with that first name was in the system, several other 𝐂𝐸s were listed. One, a man named David 𝐂𝐸, turned out to be Patrick's father. Detectives believed they were closing in on John Doe number 87's identity.
10-4, I'll be en route to that father's location.
To find out, investigators drove to nearby Parker County to interview David 𝐂𝐸 about his son. Detective Mike Utley.
Once we located Patrick 𝐂𝐸's father, we met with him at his home. And he described the Patrick 𝐂𝐸 that we thought we had as his son. It was indeed his son. He positively identified him.
What did he have to say?
Mr. 𝐂𝐸 explained that the relationship with his son had been a troubled one,
When was the last time you saw Patrick?
and he feared it had been irreparably damaged 3 years earlier. They had a bitter argument over Patrick's irresponsible behavior. Though he loved his son, David 𝐂𝐸 kicked Patrick out of the house and told him not to come back until he grew up. The last David heard, Patrick had gone to live with his mother in Alaska. He had not heard from his son since. To confirm the identity of John Doe number 87, forensic anthropologist Dr. Dana Austin compared known X-rays of Patrick 𝐂𝐸 to those taken from the murder victim. She found a perfect match. Investigators now shifted their focus to finding Patrick 𝐂𝐸's killer. They began by questioning the witness who believed her boyfriend, James Moore, and his friend, 𝐿𝐼𝐸 had been involved in the murder. Though she was now reluctant to cooperate, investigators persisted. Finally, she explained that Moore, 𝐃𝐚𝐬, and 𝐂𝐸 were members of a loosely organized gang known as the BLP. The gang dealt drugs, committed burglaries, and partied together. But according to the witness, Patrick soon fell out of favor with his peers.
And other crew members felt that Patrick 𝐂𝐸 was a little too preppy, too good looking, he dressed too nice. He just didn't really, they determined, didn't fit into their plans for their crew.
According to the witness, in the spring of 1996, James Moore and 𝐿𝐼𝐸 decided to do away with him. One evening, the three went to the golf course to collect hallucinogenic mushrooms that grew nearby. They took a shovel as well as a baseball bat for protection. The girlfriend told detectives that Moore and 𝐃𝐚𝐬 returned a few hours later without 𝐂𝐸. Though the information was incriminating, investigators realized that for the witnesses' statements to be useful, they needed to find a way to corroborate the story. In a local jail, detectives tracked down a former member of the BLP, currently serving time on a drug charge. He had information about Patrick's murder. He said that soon after Patrick disappeared, James Moore had shown him a baseball bat. On it were teeth impressions that Moore claimed were from the victim. Detective Mike Hargis.
James Moore would point out marks on the bat and say these are the marks that were caused by Skippy's teeth. And they all had referred to Patrick Zacca as Skippy. So he would show it to them and laugh about it and just generally brag about what he had done and how he'd done it.
The information provided investigators with enough probable cause to take James Moore and �eric into custody for suspicion of murder. Police also obtained warrants to search their homes. After placing James Moore in custody, police began searching his residence for proof of murder. They collected several baseball bats. Detectives were certain that one in particular was the murder weapon.
The reason I knew it was the same one because of the teeth marks about halfway down. That was important again because anytime we conduct an investigation, we're always looking for corroboration. We always look for the proof that what people say is actually so. And when we found the bat, that showed us that we were in the right place.
The evidence was forwarded to the crime lab for a closer look. A few miles away, police spotted �eric driving his vehicle. He was also taken into custody and transported to the Tarrant County Jail for questioning. While the suspects awaited interrogation, criminalists inspected the baseball bats. Forensic anthropologists positively identified the gouges on one of the bats as human teeth marks. Though they could not say with certainty that the marks had come from Patrick Zacca's teeth, the finding corroborated the inmate's testimony. Investigators had no doubt that they had Patrick Zacca's killers in their custody. When presented with the charges of murder and the evidence amassed against him, James Moore refused to make any statements. Instead, he requested the presence of his lawyer. But �eric was a different story. Fearing that his friend James Moore would accuse him of being the killer in order to avoid the death penalty, 𝐷𝑒𝑑𝑎 agreed to talk. He confessed to being a participant in the murder of Patrick Zacca, and he was willing to testify that it was all James Moore's idea. According to 𝐷𝑒𝑑𝑎, he and Moore took Zacca to the golf course not to look for hallucinogenic mushrooms, but to kill him. When they were in a secluded area, Moore struck with a baseball bat, hitting Zacca several times in the head. 𝐷𝑒𝑑𝑎 joined in, stabbing Zacca repeatedly, finishing the kill. The killers then dug a shallow grave with the very shovel Zacca had carried. They buried their secret and left to go to a party. James Moore and �eric pled guilty to the murder of Patrick Zacca. James Moore was sentenced to 20 years in prison. �eric received 45 years. Moore and 𝐷𝑒𝑑𝑎's crime had been discovered because they buried their victim in a shallow grave. In California, a more ambitious killer tried to permanently entomb his secret in concrete. On July 26, 1995, Ken Adamson entered the Indio, California Police Department to report his brother, Al Adamson, missing. He described his 66-year-old brother as an intelligent man. As a director of low-budget horror films dating back to the 1960s, Al Adamson enjoyed a cult celebrity status. After making movies for nearly 30 years, his career was starting to make a comeback. Home video releases of his earlier movies had sparked a new generation of fans worldwide.
Moore Cemetery is a cold.
As a result, he was now able to continue his passion for independent filmmaking.
In color, rated PG.
Detectives learned that Ken last spoke to his brother by telephone 6 weeks earlier. Al was having his house renovated, and he had discovered that the construction foreman, a man named Fred Fulford, had made over $4,000 in unnecessary purchases on his credit card. Ken told police that his brother was not happy. Indio detective Jack Anderson.
Mr. Adamson had planned to confront the person, Mr. Fred Fulford, the following day. And the brother was concerned for his welfare. He was not sure if there would be any violence involved, and he didn't really know this Fred Fulford very well.
Ken told the detective that he traveled to Indio the following day to check up on his brother. When he arrived, Fred Fulford answered the door. Al, he said, had just left. When Ken asked to use the bathroom, Fulford refused to let him in, saying he had just retiled that floor and it needed time to settle. Ken returned home and hadn't heard from his brother since. Though 6 weeks had passed since anyone had contact with Al Adamson, there was no evidence suggesting he had met with foul play. Still, Indio police agreed to look into the case. They went to Al Adamson's home to look around. There, they were met by a man who identified himself as the property caretaker. He said that Fred Fulford had hired him to watch the place while the renovations continued. Fulford, he explained, had left on a trip to Florida in Al Adamson's pickup truck a few weeks earlier. He hadn't seen Al in a while either, but believed the director was away scouting locations for an upcoming film. Detectives asked to look around the residence. The bedroom closet was mostly empty, and the lack of suitcases led the officers to speculate that Al Adamson had simply gone on a trip. Investigators examined the master bathroom that Fulford had prevented the director's brother from using 6 weeks earlier. The floor of the large room was covered with new tiles.
We were able to get permission to walk through the house and did not notice anything out of the ordinary. There was no unusual activity or signs of any struggle or anything like that.
Detectives began interviewing Adamson's neighbors. One nearby resident, a woman who cleaned Al Adamson's house, had information. She said that the day after Al Adamson was last seen, she saw Fred Fulford and some of the workers removing a jacuzzi from the master bathroom. She watched as they loaded it into a truck and carted it away. The following day, she noticed a cement truck parked in front of the residence. This was odd, she said, because the jacuzzi was one of Al Adamson's most prized possessions.
Mr. Adamson had really enjoyed this jacuzzi inside the residence, and he would use it almost on a year-round basis. Even though there was another one next to the pool outside, for some reason he seemed to prefer the indoor one. And this raised a lot of suspicions about why it would be taken out if, in fact, he did enjoy it that much.
Only Al Adamson and Fred Fulford knew the answers, and neither of them could be located. Weeks passed without a break in the investigation. Police were beginning to suspect that Al Adamson had not gone missing on purpose. But without a body, they had no way to prove that a crime had been committed. Police in Indio, California continued their search for cult movie director Al Adamson, reported missing 6 weeks earlier by his brother. Though investigators suspected that Fred Fulford, the man hired to renovate Adamson's house, was involved in the disappearance, they lacked proof that a crime had taken place. And Fred Fulford was nowhere to be found. While reviewing statements made by Adamson's cleaning woman, one peculiarity caught investigators' attention. Al Adamson had 2 jacuzzis in his residence, and the one that he used regularly, located in the master bathroom, had been removed by Fred Fulford the day after Adamson disappeared.
A jacuzzi that had been inside the residence had been removed, and subsequently the floor was filled in and tiled over. This raised our suspicion that he possibly was buried inside the residence.
Investigators obtained a search warrant for Al Adamson's home.
All right, we'll meet you out there in about 30 minutes.
Armed with picks and shovels, the team returned to the residence, looking to uncover proof of murder. They focused their efforts on the newly tiled bathroom floor.
As we were doing the excavation, we were stirring up a lot of dust and dirt, and there was about 10 of us crammed in this little 12-foot square room, along with our excavation equipment. Very miserable.
Normal foundations range from 4 to 6 inches in depth. Detectives found several feet of cement where the jacuzzi used to be. A layer of building material sat under that. By 8:30 the next morning, the team had been digging for 18 hours. 42 inches below the floor, they broke through a layer of dirt onto something soft. Someone had buried a comforter under the concrete. Wrapped inside, police found badly decomposed human remains.
As we removed the body from the excavation hole, we were able to determine that it was a male, probably in his mid-50s to 60, but we were not able to positively say that it was Mr. Adamson.
The remains were transported to the Riverside County Coroner's Office. Investigators needed to determine who they had found and how he had died before starting a homicide investigation. Examiners quickly noticed that the skull had suffered repeated massive blunt force trauma. This victim had been beaten to death.
Here, I wanted to show you this.
Deputy Coroner Paul Trujillo performed the autopsy.
Injuries were circular defects of approximately 1 3/4 inches of irregular edges, which would be consistent with being struck with something similar to this. Not necessarily this particular instrument, but something of this nature.
The body's state of decay put the time of death between 6 weeks and 2 months earlier. This matched the time frame during which Adamson disappeared. But investigators needed a positive identification. They had no DNA samples from Adamson to match to the body, and fingerprinting was impossible because of the advanced deterioration. This left only the use of dental records. Forensic odontologist Dr. Gordon Freeman was brought in to help. But there were no known dental x-rays of Al Adamson's teeth that could be used for comparisons. All investigators had found were written records made by Adamson's dentist a few years earlier. But fortunately, he had meticulously documented the condition of Adamson's teeth. Though it wasn't a lot to work with, Dr. Freeman began his comparisons.
The first thing we check for are the teeth present. The teeth might be been extracted, they may be present. If they are present, what we check for is dental fillings, whether they're silver dental fillings. They may have had done some crown work, whether gold crowns or porcelain crowns. In the case of the Adamson case, what we had to work with, we also had 2 removable partial dentures, both an upper and lower partial denture.
If you could slap one character for their dumb decisions, who would it be? Huh? Go on. Vent in the comments. I can't wait to read.
All of the unique features of Adamson's teeth noted in his charts matched those of the victim found buried under the tile floor. There was no doubt that Al Adamson had been found. Police believed that Fred Fulford was behind the macabre murder and burial. But with no weapon and only circumstantial evidence pointing to his guilt, investigators were a long way from proving murder. Human remains found buried beneath several feet of concrete in an Indio, California home were positively identified as missing film director Al Adamson. The 66-year-old had been murdered, and police believed that Fred Fulford, the man hired to do renovations at the director's home, was responsible. But with no physical evidence linking Fulford to the homicide, police struggled to make their case. Investigators contacted the owner of the concrete company, who had delivered cement to Adamson's home a few days after he disappeared. He positively identified a picture of Fred Fulford as the man who accepted the load. And he said Fulford paid with a check pre-signed by Al Adamson. He never saw Adamson himself. The man explained that Fulford had ordered a full 4 yards of concrete to fill in a hole left by a jacuzzi that had been recently removed. The workers offered to help him wheel in the load, but Fulford declined. The man thought it was odd that Fulford insisted on wheeling all of the heavy concrete into the house by himself. But for police, it made perfect sense. Fulford was trying to keep everyone away from a crime scene.
Be honest. Did you watch the last scene through your fingers? Comment yes or no.
Though circumstantial, police believed that all of the evidence pointed to Fred Fulford as the killer. To find him, they tracked recent activity on the murder victim's credit card.
It's going to be a long process.
The charges were being made 3,000 miles away at a Florida motel.
A lot of that may have been due to the extreme heat.
A warrant was issued for the construction foreman's arrest.
But so far we've been
When Florida police spotted Fulford still driving Al Adamson's pickup truck, they moved in and placed him under arrest. Though he was dressed in the victim's clothes, he denied any knowledge of the murder. He was extradited to California, where he stood trial for the murder of Al Adamson.
What is all
Well, it's things I
Police theorize that when Al Adamson confronted Fred Fulford over the excessive credit card purchases and threatened him with legal action, the contractor became enraged. Using a blunt instrument, likely one of the many hammers lying around the residence, he beat Adamson to death. To conceal his crime, he removed the jacuzzi from the master bathroom and buried his victim in its place. He filled in the grave with concrete, retiled the floor, and then left town, believing the eccentric director would not be missed. On March 3rd, 2000, Fred Fulford was sentenced to 25 years to life for first-degree murder. To cover their tracks, some killers choose to bury their victims in unmarked graves. But the dirt cannot always hide their crimes. With the help of forensic scientists, investigators can unearth the smallest of clues and uncover a killer's buried secrets.